Everyone's seen clay animation at some point in their lives. If you haven't, well, here you go. While the popularity of clay stop motion has fluctuated, it's still a medium that survives today with its origins dating back over a century ago. This is Will Vinton, the man many see as the face behind the medium, though the real story is filled with some conflicting reports. Depending on your age or interests, there's a reason why you may have never heard of him before. This is a story of a man who may not have always made the best decisions, letting his personal creative ambitions ultimately be his downfall. This is the story of Claymation, an unfortunate tale of loss and lost potential. William Vinton was born on November 17, 1947 in McMinnville, Oregon. He had two sisters, Alice and Mary, and a stepsister, Jane, from his father's previous marriage. His father, Gale Vinton, sadly had both of his parents pass while he was still an infant. According to his birth certificate, he was born as Gale Spencer. But before his father passed, he gave Gale to accomplished Oregon politician and attorney William T. Vinton. Gale's last name was subsequently changed from Spencer to Vinton, and he presumably named his son Will Vinton after his adopted father. Gale grew up to be a sergeant in the National Guard and went on to own a Shell service station, where he met a man named Herman Larson. The two partnered to open a dealership, Vinton and Larson, Buick, Pontiac, and GMC. The Larson Motors brand was actually still active until 2018, when the family sold it to the Lum family. Will's mother, Sima Vinton, first worked at a local McMinnville bank but eventually settled as a bookkeeper in nearby Yamhill County. As a kid, Vinton surprisingly wasn't much of a creative. His older sisters were actually the ones doing things like dancing and playing instruments, which inevitably rubbed off on Will. He played drums in a few high school bands and took tap dancing with his sisters, something he quite enjoyed even though he was also a jock. He designed go-karts and boogie boards and did upholstery jobs on his car. He said his parents put up with a lot. I wanted to cover more on Will's younger years, but I admittedly couldn't find much. I'm sure this video will reach the good people of Oregon, so if you knew Will personally, especially as a kid, we'd love to hear more about him. I also have a small disclaimer. I will be telling the events of Will Vinton's early career as he outlines them, but afterwards we'll look at another point of view from someone who apparently knew Will Vinton and their conflicting recollection of those same events. After graduating from McMinnville High School in 1966, his sister, who was in California, convinced Will to attend the University of California, Berkeley. He studied architecture and fell in love with the work of Catalan architect Antoni Gaudí. If you ever visited Barcelona, Spain, you absolutely know his work. One of his creations being the most popular tourist attraction in all of Spain, La Sagrada Familia. It was these fun organic shapes that led Will Vinton to pick up some clay to mimic Gaudí's whimsical forms. I'm not sure how serious Vinton really was about architecture, as something else quickly caught more of his attention: film and filmmaking. This was an interesting time in America with the counterculture movement. We're talking hippies, civil rights, Vietnam War protests, drugs, sexual liberation, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., the Black Panthers. So much was happening, and so much of it was happening right there in California, and Will Vinton wanted to capture that moment in time. Armed with his father's 16mm camera, Will produced his first documentary film he called Gone for a Better Deal, which explored the youth culture at that time. The film was received well and went on to tour film festivals. He produced two more films about student protests, Berkeley Games, and First 10 Days, as well as a short film called Reply about architecture. I said Vinton used clay to emulate Antoni Gaudí. He said, "If I really wanted to be inspired by designs like Gaudí's, I had to throw away the T-square and straight edge and grab some plasticine clay. This isn't like the soft clay we played with as kids that dries out. That clay is usually made of water and flour. This was an oil-based clay that stays soft." Created in 1880 by German pharmacist Franz Kolb as a solution to his sculptor friends who complained about their clay drying too quickly, especially in the cold winter months. He later brought it to the market in 1890 and even offered it to a company that you may be familiar with if you're an artist, Faber-Castell. However, if you ask anyone in the UK or most of the world, you'll likely get a different answer for modeling clay's inventor. In 1874, a man named William Harbutt had recently moved to Bathampton, London. For a time, he worked at an art school but eventually opened up his own, the Paragon Art Studio, with his wife Elizabeth, who was also a well-known artist. He noticed his students had difficulty with the heavy clay that dried before projects could be completed, so he worked tirelessly coming up with a solution with his family. In 1897, he finally started to hand out his new non-drying clay to his students. Harbut's grandchildren were very interested in the invention, which gave him the idea to market the product, where it became mass-produced and was a hit among the children of England. Franz Kolb's clay was reportedly patented in 1880, nearly 2 decades before William Harbut got his patent in 1899. So what happened here? Why is Harbut renowned for inventing plasticine clay? Well, it seems that Germany's patent rights failed Kolb. Harbut had technically created a new formula, and his patent from England granted him more rights to the invention than Kolb. Also, Harbut just took the whole thing further, with more colors, formulas, and better marketing. But Kolb's modeling clay still lives on and has found great use in modeling cars for company Kolb Design Technology. Along with filmmaking, Vinton also enjoyed watching films, like this one, Clay or the Origin of Species, which he cites as an early influence that made him want to establish filmmaking methods to clay animation. Will Vinton's new fascination of clay and filmmaking collided, and he began experimenting with the two, animating clay one frame at a time. In case you don't know, video is just photos stringed together, typically 24, 30, or 60. The standard for animation is 24, meaning 24 photos make 1 second of video. Thankfully, Will wasn't alone. There was an experimental film community he was a part of, and they'd help Will by participating in some clay animation in his dorm. Will would set up the clay and camera, his friends would drink and smoke, and they'd all have a good time creating some animations. Sometimes we made pretty obscene things out of it, but no matter what we did, the clay always came to life, said Vinton. Among these friends who helped was one of Will's roommates, an art student named James Robbins Gardner, or simply Bob Gardner. From what I've read, Bob went to the California College of the Arts, another school that was also in Berkeley, though I'm not quite sure how they ended up living together. Bob and Will teamed up to create a short animated film called Culture Shock, composed of Will's father's home video footage and clay experiments. Unfortunately, the film is nowhere to be found online. At least I couldn't find it. The film went on to earn them a first place prize at the Berkeley Film Festival, which encouraged both young artists. Now, this is where things get tricky. Here is the retelling of the events from another person's perspective. I read this from somebody online, so take it with a grain of salt. Vinton was reportedly working at the Berkeley Film Library by the end of his college career. He lived with about 4 to 5 other art students in a house, and would sometimes borrow a projector from the library to have a movie night with his housemates and friends. On one of these nights, Will brought over a film believed to be called Permutations. I couldn't find this film online either, but it said it was a simple black and white film with clay balls and worms moving around a table. This permutation film sparked creativity in Will's housemates, one of whom was Bob Gardiner. It was this group who started experimenting, when Bob grabbed some clay and sculpted the head of Richard Nixon. It turned out Bob had a real knack for this clay stuff. He and a couple others in the group quickly thought to grab a camera and start snapping the clay like that Permutations film. And who did they know that had a camera? Will Vinton. Will had the equipment and the editing know-how, but that was it. He didn't actually help with any of the animating in this first production, presumably Culture Shock or just some other experiment. That's mostly it for this person's recounting of events. There was more, but long story short, Will may not have been the creative he claimed to be, at least not at first. So who knows if the Antoni Gaudí origins were real. I did actually read an interview with Bob Gardner where he mentioned Culture Shock and said this: "I sculpted, he clicked the camera, and input came from all attending, anyone in the room." So there were indeed other people involved. Whether or not they were hands-on is anyone's guess. I tried getting more information, but this source never got back to me. I just think there's some missing details of Vinton's early days that needs more clarification, because in interviews, Will often flip-flops about his role in these early productions. Will Vinton graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in architecture in 1971 and moved back to Oregon, though not his small hometown of McMinnville. Rather, he bought his first home in nearby Portland, where he and his wife lived, a woman named Bevan McEachern. Again, unsure when or how they met, this kind of info is limited. Vinton got busy setting up his basement as a studio and worked some odd jobs for small film companies and such. He happened to know his old colleague, Bob Gardner, wasn't up to much after graduating. Based on an interview, I believe Bob was working at a machine shop in Santa Ana doing 10-hour shifts. Will gave him a call so they could continue their work together. He eventually convinced Bob to move to Portland and live in his basement, much to his wife Bevan's dismay. In 1973, the two quickly started their next big project, this time a short film with the goal to prove clay as a viable animation medium, since most respected animation at this time was 2D cell animation for kids. Will wanted to shake things up. Bob was a pretty special character, very wild, but also a creative genius. He was into psychedelics, which might have helped with the production of their eventual film if I'm being honest. Will needed Bob, and Bob needed Will. With Will's producing skills and Bob's sculpting skills, they were the perfect pair. Will got the camera equipment figured out, and Bob figured out the system for animating, using armatures, which is essentially a skeleton for the clay, and getting the speed of everything correct. You see, the animation can easily become too fast, too slow, or too jerky if you don't move the clay the correct amount each frame. Bob realized how film and animation have the same amount of frames, so he got the brilliant idea of filming live scenes before animating so he could copy the movement speed frame by frame with his stop frame projector. This technique is similar to rotoscoping, essentially tracing a live action scene for animation. First, they created a short 1.5 minute test called Wobbly Wino. Why wobbly and why was he drunk? Because they couldn't get the clay figure to walk properly yet. This test eventually turned into their first short film called Closed Mondays, a 7 to 8 minute film about an inebriated man who stumbles into a closed art gallery at night where all the art seems to come to life. That pseudo-rotoscoping technique was used for the film, especially for lip-syncing the life-size bust of the man for close-up shots. They filmed the friend to capture subtle facial movements, and Bob constructed the head with a plastic skull underneath. The outcome was a groundbreaking achievement for clay animation. The film took over 11,000 frames and 14 months to complete, after which Bob was kicked out of living in Vinton's basement by his wife. They tried entering Closed Mondays into the Northwest Filmmakers Festival in Portland, where the judge watched it for all of 2 minutes and rejected it. Will and Bob were disheartened, but Will luckily had a connection. A friend who owned a small theater in the city and screened it to audiences before their feature film. I believe this friend also helped submit Closed Mondays to film festivals, where it won top prize in almost 100 of them, and was even shown at the Cannes Film Festival, the most prestigious film festival in the world. And because it was shown in a theater and won numerous awards, it was now eligible for an Academy Award. Just like many of those film festivals it won, Closed Mondays was the winner for Best Animated Short Film in 1975, becoming the very first stop-motion film to win an Oscar. Most notably, it beat out Winnie the Pooh and Tigger 2 by Disney. In a world dominated by 2D cell animated children's cartoons, Will Vinton had accomplished his goal of proving clay as a viable medium for animation. While celebrating their Oscar at the Governor's Ball, Bob's mother approached him with some concern over the award, saying it was too much success too soon, that this would be the kiss of death. As we know, Bob was a wild guy, but he and Will were equals. However, after winning the award, the two had very different outlooks on their success. Where Vinton saw more opportunities, Gardner was more short-sighted and lavished in the immediate praise, flaunting the award around town for the recognition and status it brought him, according to Will anyway. While the award didn't bring them any financial gain, it did bring in more work. Soon large brands wanted Will and Bob for commercials to help distinguish themselves from other brands, as clay stop motion was now new and fresh. The first commercial the pair worked on was for Rainer beer, which used this peaceful forest setting. The short 30-second ad took 2 months to produce, much of which was spent building the set. After the commercial, the set was just lying around, taking up space. Instead of throwing it away, they decided to blow it up, which became their next short film, Mountain Music, in 1976. However, before Mountain Music could be completed, Will Vinton and Bob Gardiner parted ways. There's no exact reason, but it wouldn't be difficult to see why. Bob only worked on some of the animation for Mountain Music, but was still credited. He later went on to say that Mountain Music was shot poorly, that there were too many shots looking down on the set, which ruined the sense of scale. He said it was better for things to be shot at eye level or just below that. The progression of clay animation came steadily. At this point, the human characters were still awkward. Regardless of that, Mountain Music won first place at the Hemisfilm International Film Festival. Seeing as how this clay thing was taking off, Will recruited 6 employees, some of whom were old friends from his college days, architects and artists. Among these was a woman named Susan Shadburn, who Vinton would marry soon thereafter. Yeah, he left his other wife at some point and got married to Susan around 1977. The group rented a home which was converted into a studio behind a barbershop and founded the first animation studio in Portland, Will Vinton Productions. The small crew loved it. It was fun and not corporate at all, with one animator saying it felt like art school plus vacation. Those of you who went to art school know what that's like. Bob Gardiner also went on to do his own thing, starting his own business located in Portland's Chinatown on the 3rd floor of an old building. This is information from an interview he did, but there's some missing details, so be mindful of that. Bob did a number of 30 to 60 second commercials for public service and politics, but probably his biggest claim to fame outside of Will Vinton's shadow was doing a 45-second clay animated opening for the 10th anniversary of the Rolling Stones magazine, a 2-hour special which aired in 1977. However, the project came with an unrealistic deadline, less than a month, which turned into just 20 days when he factored in the post-color correcting process. Obviously, Bob couldn't manage this alone, so he called for help from a team called The Film Loft, whom he made commercials with before. Bob already had a storyboard he worked out with the show director and writer, now they just needed to deliver. The team thought it best to carefully plan everything out as to avoid reshoots, which weren't feasible due to the deadline. The Rolling Stones also wanted celebrity lookalikes in the crowd, like Frank Zappa, John Lennon, Jimmy Carter, and other famous writers and reporters at that time. Having a famous figure be recognizable with only seconds of screen time was indeed a nightmare. Needless to say, the demands were very high and Bob couldn't deliver. At least that's what's been said. You can actually find the special online and Bob's opening is there, so I'm not exactly sure what people mean. In any case, this was kind of the last noteworthy thing he'd do. He also did some work on 2 Smothers Brothers specials with his friend Mason Williams, who was a guitarist, writer, and comedian. Bob was also multi-talented. He dabbled in holograms, paintings, songwriting, and comedy among other things. But for as talented as Bob was, it seemed difficult for him to make a name for himself. It's been said by others who knew him that Bob Gardiner needed a producer like Will Vinton to keep things on track. Unfortunately, Bob also had a dark side to him. After parting ways with Vinton, Gardner grew increasingly agitated with him and his success in the industry, continuing to claim Will Vinton stole his work and took all the credit. Now, while that may be true, I also believe Will Vinton is a good guy, and there definitely would have been a place for him alongside Will if Bob wasn't so difficult to work with. The best short description given of Bob's behavior was bipolar. We'll have more on Bob later. Over the next 3 years, Will Vinton Productions created 3 27-minute clay films. Martin the Cobbler was first and a big step in clay animation. The film chose to focus a lot more on the human characters, so they tackled a lot of that initial awkward movement. For one, animator Barry Bruce helped design better looking characters with nicer, more caricatured features, unlike the realistic models of past projects. Martin was also an old man, so he moved slow, and the outdoor snow helped excuse some awkward motion. Overall, this was a step up from Closed Mondays, which was created just 3 years prior. Rip Van Winkle was next, and again improved on the animation and experimented more, like this interesting scene with a reflection and this dream sequence with 2D relief animation. Sometime before Rip Van Winkle, a short documentary featuring the animation process was filmed. The documentary's title was special. It debuted a catchy new word that we still use today.
Clay.
Claymation, claymation.
Yes, claymation is actually a term created and trademarked by Will Vinton. I also read that Bob Gardiner thought of the name, but he actually preferred the term sculptamation, as this was a sculpting art form. In any case, Will Vinton trademarked the name and became known as the inventor of claymation, but he was by no means the first to animate clay on camera. The most well-known guy credited as the father of clay animation is Arthur Clokey. He produced this experimental film called Gumbasia in 1953. The film impressed one of his students' fathers, Sam Ingle, who happened to be president of the Motion Picture Producers Association. Sam wanted to see more from Arthur. He wanted to collaborate to produce high-quality children's television. This eventually turned into a character who has withstood the test of time, Gumby. The full story is fascinating, and I'll make a video about it someday. Art Clokey produced 120 episodes of Gumby and is often credited as the father of clay animation. But just like with everything in this episode, the real story is a bit more complicated. For you beautiful people of Oregon, there's this animation by news reporter filmmaker Lewis Cook from 1925, who actually established the film archive at the Oregon Historical Society. And if you want to go back even further and get more technical, there's this scene from the live-action short film The Sculptor's Nightmare from 1908. And who knows, there may even be something that predates this, but that's a topic for another day. Now that the term claymation was coined, their third film, The Little Prince, used the name in its intro. An interesting technique was used for this third animation. In Rip Van Winkle, real images of the sky were used, which was fine, but to push the purity even further, animator Joan Gratz produced a sky with a pane of glass with a mixture of clay and oil paint. This technique would actually win her an Oscar over a decade later in 1993 for her animated short film Mona Lisa Descending the Staircase. Although the films garnered positive reception, the clay business was not very lucrative, earning them just $5,000 in their first 5 years. Enough to keep going, but not enough to pay the team. By this point, they were finally getting the hang of things and went on to produce several more animations of shorter length, like Legacy, Dinosaurs, A Christmas Gift, The Creation, which was about the book of Genesis and narrated by James Earl Jones, voice of Darth Vader, and The Great Cognito. Some of these were passion projects, while others were commissioned to be used for child education, like Legacy and Dinosaurs, which covered the history of the Earth. Vinton said this was a satisfying time, commercially and professionally. Although it's reported that Vinton didn't make a living off of claymation for the first 7 years, what did keep him going were the fans he had at film festivals. By 1984, the team had more than doubled in size. As they brought new people on board, they needed to train them, as no school taught Vinton's claymation yet. The team continued to push the envelope of clay animation, all of which culminated in 1985 with their first and only full-length feature film, The Adventures of Mark Twain. This initially started as a short film, The Diaries of Adam and Eve, a book by Mark Twain, but blossomed to cover more Mark Twain stories. This was their magnum opus. Will called it the zenith of claymation. All clay techniques and effects they had learned were used for the film. Everything you see in the movie is clay, from the water to the sky. Will Vinton said, "I don't think a film will ever be made quite so painstakingly with only clay ever again. Any stop motion film these days is going to be about 40% CG. The Adventures of Mark Twain was sold to distributor Atlantic Releasing, who were nearing bankruptcy. The distributor had a label which dealt more with kid films, this being Clubhouse Pictures. The distributor felt that since this was animated, that it should be marketed as a children's movie, so it got the Clubhouse treatment. But as we've gone over, these claymation productions were the opposite. The whole point Will Vinton was trying to make was that animation could be sophisticated, that these were more than the cartoon animations children watched. But Atlantic Releasing didn't listen and gave it a G rating, which upset Vinton, since it only further cemented the fact that this was for kids. And to top it all off, part of the Clubhouse contract was only being shown at matinee hours, the morning time. While the film received great reviews by adults, the film ultimately didn't do great, as children weren't raving about it and adults weren't the ones being targeted. Although the film failed financially, with a $1.5 million budget and grossing just $850,000, it has found new appreciation on the internet today for its most iconic scene, which I think many of us have come across in our youth while browsing early YouTube or more recently on social media. Yes, the mysterious stranger scene. Undoubtedly the darkest scene of the 86-minute story, a scene which deals with themes of death and religion. Not the first time they tackled such themes, as their first story, Martin the Cobbler, was about feeling abandoned by God. I'm surprised the film got a G rating with this scene. They even put a disclaimer on the film for parental guidance, which makes me feel like they should have just rated it PG. Interestingly, the mysterious stranger was voiced by a male and female performer. They did this to give an androgynous voice to the character. If you've never seen this film, it definitely deserves a watch. After Mark Twain, Will Vinton Studios had their first big project outside of their own productions. They'd done other film work, like animating a trailer for movie Divine Madness, but their first big break was with a Disney movie, Return to Oz. Quite the surprise, since Will Vinton really wanted to be the next Walt Disney. More on that later. After Disney bought the rights to the remaining Oz books, director Walter Murch decided to make a sort of sequel to the beloved MGM classic. After Walter saw some of Vinton's work at a film festival, he got in contact with the studio and they brainstormed how to tackle the character of the gnomes, who were rock-like creatures. Pretty tricky considering clay is soft and they hadn't done anything like this before, especially for live action. They developed large-sized puppets for greater detail, but the clay became quite heavy, which made small adjustments very difficult. And small adjustments there were plenty of. This time around, they worked more in single frames, meaning they had to move the figure once for every single frame, which I thought is what they always did, but it depends. Sometimes animators capture 2 frames at a time. Since this was a feature film, however, they had the money for higher quality animation. Unfortunately, the film kinda flopped, mostly due to the very dark tones, which borderlined on being a horror film for kids. But they did get nominated for Best Visual Effects and got to work more with Disney. Quick editor's note here. I started calling Will Vinton Productions Will Vinton Studios. I had to edit out a part discussing that. The studio's name did change, but turns out it wasn't until the early 90s, I believe. Also, the studio had a bit of a transition period around this time, finally moving on from their humble barbershop home studio. If you're interested in that, there's a great video by former director animator Doug Aberley, which highlights this Mark Twain Return to Oz era. After the poor release of the Mark Twain movie, Will Vinton kept his same positive attitude. While it's nice to have a positive figure at the helm, positivity doesn't pay the bills. Will's father had aspirations of his son becoming a sort of corporate executive, but Will wasn't much of a businessman. Despite this, the studio was doing pretty well by this point, even if Mark Twain and Return to Oz weren't commercial successes. The studio was creating high-quality productions that were praised by those who saw them. A lot of comparisons to Walt Disney were being made around this time. The most obvious was having a lead creative be the face of the studio. Will loved the idea of being the Disney of claymation, but in order to achieve that, you unfortunately need to take most of the credit for the work. Sadly, some of the staff did feel like they weren't getting appreciated enough. It's like when you were a kid and heard the name Walt Disney and thought he was somehow the one animating all those moving pictures. Will wanted that for himself. Now, as much as I'd hate to skip around, there really were so many projects and commercials being created. I said earlier that big advertisers were asking for commercials. By this point, they had done ads for brands like Levi's, Visa, Quaker, Illinois Lottery, Nickelodeon, Twizzlers, John Deere, KFC, Captain Crunch, and even Nike, which is interesting foreshadowing if you know the story. Among the most popular of their commercial campaigns came out in 1986 with the Domino's Noid. Advertising agency Group 243 hired Vinton and his team for the Avoid the Noid campaign. What ensued was this rather odd campaign of this man-rabbit creature in a red skin-tight suit who tried to prevent your pizza from getting delivered on time. In spite of the confusing messaging, it caught on, spawning 2 video games, and it almost got a cartoon, but that was stopped when people called out the corporate greed of the decision, just blatant advertising disguised for children. The Noid was short-lived, however, as in January 1989, a 22-year-old schizophrenic man named Kenneth Lamar Noid believed the commercial to be about him. Armed with a revolver, he took 2 Domino's employees hostage in Chamblee, Georgia, and demanded $100,000 and a white limousine getaway. Curiously, Kenneth Noid agreed to exchange one hostage for this book, The Widow's Son, a novel about Freemasons. However, he didn't let the hostage go, but kept the book, and ordered the employees to make him some food. While eating, Kenneth put down his gun, which led to the 2 employees escaping, leading Kenneth to finally surrender to police after more than 5 hours. Mr. Noid was put into a mental institution, but could never cope with the idea that the Noid mascot was about him, and tragically took his own in 1995. The Noid stopped being used but made a brief return in 2011 for this awful Facebook game. In 2021, it looked like Domino's had plans to revive the character, with a small marketing campaign and a crossover no one asked for with popular video game character Crash Bandicoot. But as far as I'm aware, this mascot is dead and buried again. Although the Noid was short-lived, it has surprisingly stayed in the mind of pop culture. Around the same time as the Noid, Will Vinton Studios created their biggest cultural phenomenon, the California Raisins. Conceptualized by advertising agency Foot Cone & Belding, it all started when a 31-year-old copywriter named Seth Verner was growing dissatisfied with his work. He wasn't getting to work on the exciting stuff like the Levi 501 Blues campaign, which the agency had done in the past. So he took matters into his own hands and asked his boss what more could be done. His boss gave him the California Raisin Advisory Board account, by far their smallest account. I believe they advertised California Raisins in general, not any brand in particular, but at the same time they worked with raisin adjacent brands. They actually had a $50,000 advertising deal with the Back to the Future film, which was executed poorly. The directors didn't like the idea of making raisins part of the plot, and were confused by the proposal of putting raisins in the film with no brand name attached. They were to include a scene of Marty McFly eating raisins, but that was cut, and all the California Raisins got was their name on a bus bench where a homeless guy was sleeping. This whole ordeal nearly turned into a lawsuit, but the California Raisins got half their money back instead. I just wanted to include that story, but back to Seth Verner. The California Raisins was a rather boring account, but Seth got to work on an idea. He later joked with a friend, "I will probably do something stupid, like having a bunch of raisins dancing to the song I Heard It Through the Grapevine." While meant as a joke, he found it to be a genius idea. He pitched his idea to the entire advisory board, putting on a bit of a show, playing the music and dancing with some white gloves on. The board loved it. Seth and his partner Dexter Fedor started conceptualizing the group of raisins. The two partners felt 2D animation wasn't the way to go, so they hired Will Vinton to bring the idea to life. Buddy Miles, who played drums for Jimi Hendrix, was chosen to sing the cover of the song. Everything came together and the commercial took over a month to shoot. This short commercial became what set Will Vinton Studios ablaze. The raisins went completely viral and sales of raisins went up 20%. Their version of I Heard It Through the Grapevine made it to the 84th spot on the Billboard Top 100, and millions of dollars of raisin merchandise was being sold. They released albums, made appearances in other Vinton projects, and of course got their own short film, followed by a 13-episode Saturday morning cartoon, and then another short film after that. Vinton got a bit ambitious with it all and tried for a full TV movie in 1990, but those plans fell through due to declining popularity of the raisins by that time, which also caused a planned video game to be scrapped. By the mid-90s, the raisins were pretty much gone. But before that, the name Will Vinton had finally become a household name, and the studio soon got more offers, like animating Bruce Willis as a frog in this episode of Moonlighting. They also animated singer Ray Charles for one of the Raisins commercials, and got a series of interesting voicemails. Take a listen.
Will, I really need you to call me. This is Michael calling again. Will, it's Michael calling. Are you there? Will?
The Raisins really were a cultural sensation. Will Vinton had one of the biggest celebrities practically begging and harassing him to be in one of his commercials. It's worth noting, however, that Michael and Will had a bit of a past. Will did some work on the Disney Epcot movie Captain EO, produced by George Lucas and starring Michael Jackson. Also, Will Vinton was a producer on Michael Jackson's Speed Demon music video. Jackson had recently had a bad experience with Pepsi, where his hair caught on fire during a commercial shoot. He didn't even like Pepsi. If you watch those commercials, the first of which had Alfonso Ribeiro from The Fresh Prince, you'll see they cut away from Michael pretty often. This is because he refused to be shown for more than a few seconds at a time. He also didn't want to be seen holding a Pepsi can. After this pyrotechnics incident, he swore off doing commercials, the experience leaving him burned and traumatized. The Raisins commercials, on the other hand, were alluring to him, since he didn't have to put his body at risk. He didn't even need to be there in person. It was so perfect he did it for free. Michael sent Will this video demonstrating how the character should move. He'd eventually get his wish and be turned into a raisin in 1989. For these celebrity raisins, I believe they were shown in theaters rather than TV. The unfortunate thing about all this success was that Will Vinton didn't get any of the licensing. They'd done a lot of commercials before and didn't think it'd be a problem, but it just so happened that this campaign caught on like wildfire, and now they missed out on millions. Just one of the many poor business decisions Vinton made for not being a businessman. But they still made their fair share, reportedly about $3 million annually while the raisins were still hot, and the team grew to about 50 to 60. Also, Will's father finally stopped worrying about his son getting a real job. He wanted Will to be a corporate executive or something, but was also very supportive of his children experimenting and following their passions. The Raisins came and went, but did make a small return for restaurant Hardee's, who had been creating raisin figurines since the 80s for their cinnamon raisin biscuits. They released their last set in 2001, and the following year, the Raisins made an appearance on the popular TV show Unwrapped. With all this fame and success, how do you think Bob Gardiner felt? His grudge only grew, and his retaliation only got worse. Vinton Studios employees would arrive to the building vandalized, with graffiti that said things like Will Vinton. In this case, Swill possibly meaning greedy. Vinton would even receive phone calls in the middle of the night from Gardner threatening his life. In 1989, while the Raisins were still popular, Will Vinton was granted the honor of being Grand Marshal in the Portland Rose Festival. This led to Bob Gardiner threatening to assassinate Will from the top of a building, like something out of 1963 if you catch my drift. The FBI got involved to ensure nothing happened, and the parade went without incident. While living in Portland, Bob did meet someone, Kara Evanson. The two never got married, but they did have two daughters, Sarah and Nicole, who were both born in the early 80s. Bob cherished both his daughters deeply and found it difficult to be away from them. We'll hear more about Bob one last time, but as of 1991, he no longer lived in Oregon. He went back to California, to Nevada County, presumably without his daughters, and then settled in Grass Valley, California with his mother while working at the Powerhouse Mining Museum, giving tours. Bob was pretty sentimental about his family's history, his family having lived near the area for generations, so this was a pretty sweet gig for him. We'll check on Bob later. A little fun fact I'll shove in here, an animator named Craig Bartlett worked at Will Vinton Studios and created these clay animated shorts for Pee-wee's Playhouse. Arnold Escapes from Church, which spawned two more, The Arnold Waltz, and Arnold Rides a Chair, which aired on Sesame Street. If the name Craig Bartlett sounds familiar, or if his films look familiar, it's because Bartlett went on to produce Hey Arnold for Nickelodeon in 1996. Vinton Studios had a lot of talented animators that went on to do great things after leaving the studio. Another being Mark Gustafson, who started at Will Vinton Studios, working on Mark Twain, Return to Oz, was director for the Raisins commercials, produced these Mr. Resistor shorts, this popular Nissan commercial with music from Van Halen, a short for Home Improvement, and a slew of other things. He was so influential at the studio that it landed him bigger projects down the line, like being animation director for Fantastic Mr. Fox, an amazing stop-motion film by Wes Anderson, and more recently, the 2022 Pinocchio Netflix film, which he co-directed with Guillermo del Toro. He unfortunately passed away in February 2024 from a heart attack, but we'll still be talking about him later. There's been so much talent at Will Vinton Studios that I probably just scratched the surface. Please leave your inclusions for great animators down below in the comments, I'd love to take a look. After the Raisins craze was over, you'd think advertisers would be begging Will Vinton Studios to work with their brand, but the opposite actually happened. Advertisers became turned off by Claymation due to its strong cultural association with raisins. They wanted something different to stand out. This led to the studio trying to breathe life back into the medium by experimenting with computer graphics, which was finally becoming a feasible option at this time. More on that in a bit. In 1991, Will Vinton Studios cooked up what they believed to be the next big thing, Claymation comedy of horrors, which starred Wilshire Pig. As we've gone over, Will Vinton was chasing the Walt Disney dream, and this was his push to try and create some original characters, with the eventual endgame of opening up an amusement park in Portland called Claymation Station, with Wilshire Pig being his Mickey Mouse. Blueprints were made and the park was approved by Portland. It was going to have everything, rides, restaurants, a hotel, a theater, but the financial side of things didn't pan out and that's where the dream ended. Vinton divorced once again around this time, I estimate around 1989 or 1990. I'd quickly like to say that from the testimonies I've heard of people who knew Will personally, he was a bit of a mystery. He was always this bright cheery guy for the most part, but that really made it hard to humanize him. You only got to see one side of him, as a leader, producer, and artist. Yeah, that's three, but you know what I mean. His second wife Susan commented saying she felt uneasy about Will having a previous divorce and him refusing to talk about it. He feels like a guy who says he was doing great when maybe he really wasn't. At least that's what his former employees thought of him. He just wasn't very vocal about feelings and may have internalized a lot. No one knows how he ever truly felt. Will would get married for a third and final time, I believe. Some sources say he had 4 wives, but I could never find a name for all 4. Will went on to have 3 kids, Jesse, Billy, and Alexandria, the first of which followed in his father's footsteps. We'll discuss more about Jesse when the time comes. The studio's next and arguably last hit came in the mid-90s. Computers were seeing massive growth in adoption and capabilities. Will Vinton Studios was smart and chose to adapt by learning 3D computer animation, which had finally become more user-friendly, and was being heavily utilized in the latest blockbuster films. Over the next few years, the studio would form a CGI department, initially starting with 3 and growing to 20 artists. Some were new hires and others were former stop-motion animators. Of these new hires was an animator named David Daniels, who started with the company in 1992. An experienced animator who had worked with MTV and had even invented his own form of animation, strata cut animation, which he got to feature in this popular 1986 music video, Big Time. David was also into computers and helped the studio get started with computer animation. In 1991, Vinton had tried convincing agencies that claymation could still be new and exciting. He pitched the idea of combining claymation with computer animation. After showcasing their new capabilities, in 1994, Nabisco came knocking for some advertising for Chips Ahoy, which was the first time the studio did computer animation. This 30-second ad took 60 days to produce. That same year, M&M's had a commercial airing with CGI as well, with a campaign of celebrities done by another animation studio, Blue Sky Studios, the same people who went on to do the movie Ice Age. In 1995, M&M's hired ad agency BBDO. The account was given to creative partners Steve Rudder and Susan Credle, who both thought of M&M's as boring and unimaginative, because at that time they kind of were. M&M's had 2 sickly sweet characters who shilled for the company, as Susan put it. Neither she nor Steve wanted to work with M&M's, saying they'd only do it for 6 months and believing it would ruin their rookie careers. They met with the new chief marketing officer of Mars, Paul Michaels, to have a discussion, where Susan boldly said, "We should kill the characters. M&M's is a quintessential beautiful product. It deserves better." To which Paul Michaels disagreed and said, "Go create characters that you want to write for, characters that you can get excited about." So Steve and Susan used sitcoms as inspiration. Enter Will Vinton and his team. BBDO wanted to work with the man himself to help launch M&M's new color, blue. Yeah, blue wasn't always around, believe it or not. However, according to David Daniels, there were creative differences. They were trying to make Seinfeld with Candy, the agency, and he was trying to make Mark Twain with Candy. So instead, they decided to work with Will's assistant director, Larry Baffia. But after Vinton lashed out at Baffia during a voice recording session, he quit. I might be reading this interview incorrectly, but it seems like Vinton wanted things done a certain way, but Baffia was trying to please BBDO, not Vinton. The role was then given to David Daniels, who became the animation director, the first director at the studio to not be homegrown. The new campaign did very well, showing celebrities alongside the candies. Even the voice actors were stars, like Red being voiced by John Lovitz and later Billy West, and Yellow being voiced by John Goodman and later J.K. Simmons. There was some initial concern over budget and creating this cast of characters, but Susan and Steve treated it just like a sitcom, where new characters were introduced in later commercials. First Red and Yellow, and then their new color Blue, and so on. The campaign went beyond just commercials. They treated the cast like toys, which was genius since movies and shows made way more money off merchandising. We even got a Christmas-themed commercial that still airs to this day, which got a sequel over 2 decades later. This earned Will Vinton Studios their place with BBDO and M&M's, and they continued doing commercials for them for the next several years. It was a match made in heaven. In these early days of CGI, it was easy for the studio to adjust, as they knew their way around creating 3D characters. They were just doing it on the computer now. Yeah, I'd say that was sort of the end of the golden years for the studio. Even Will was starting to feel the same. By this point, the company had ballooned to over 100 employees in between 3 or 4 buildings. This once small team of passionate creatives had grown into a much larger entity that lived or died by its profits. The studio had its hands busy with mostly commercials, only seldom doing short films, and other projects like working on these clay tunes for Disney Channel's Adventures in Wonderland, or these Cecile shorts for Sesame Street. As popular as the name Will Vinton may have seemed, the company was struggling financially. They still did great work, but the studio had gotten too big for its own good, and Vinton missed the old days of getting his hands dirty with clay. Now he was more of a corporate boss, I guess how his father envisioned he be. But he wasn't a passionate creative anymore. Interestingly, Vinton did implement something called a walkabout program, letting his animators fill their own creative needs by taking time off to produce personal projects. Now, I'm not sure when this happened, but before we get into the final chapter of Will Vinton Studios, I'd like to mention that Steve Jobs approached Will Vinton to buy the company. You see, Steve Jobs was CEO of Pixar at this time and wanted to buy out Vinton's millions of stocks in exchange for Pixar stock, which obviously would have been extremely lucrative for Will. He estimated he would have been one of the largest shareholders of Disney had he accepted. I imagine this happened in the early days of Pixar. Either Vinton didn't foresee what they would become, or he was happy continuing his own work. In 1997, Hollywood producer Ron Howard got in contact with Will Vinton about an idea comedian actor Eddie Murphy had to produce a primetime stop-motion television show called The PJs, a story about a family living in the projects of Detroit. Will knew this was a big opportunity, so in an attempt to get his old job back and to set the company on a better path, he stepped down as CEO and in his place hired Tom Turpin, an MBA Harvard graduate who successfully started his career in the corporate finance department of Goldman Sachs. He was also president and CEO of a digital media division at Virgin Entertainment, dubbing himself Richard Branson's media arm. Tom was a very dashing man. He and Will got along great, and he'd lead Vinton Studios to make better financial decisions so they could pursue future artistic endeavors, like potentially making another feature film. He came on board in 1997. Mark Gustafson, who we mentioned earlier, became supervising director for the PJs and recalls the concerns before the project even began. How would they create 22-minute episodes when doing a 30-second ad took weeks or even months? It wasn't feasible unless they used another animation technique. Instead of clay, this time they used foam latex. These were essentially lightweight figurines that could be manipulated without all the repairing that comes with clay. This technique was more animator friendly. Will Vinton called this Claymation, but from what I've read, this technique was already around, kinda how clay animation was around and he called his version Claymation. Although production time was shortened, the animation phase would still take about 12 weeks per episode. In 1998, before the PJ show aired, now CEO Tom Turpin brought in private investors since the company was struggling financially and needed money to fund their ambitious TV and feature film dreams. They also mass hired as the workload was going up, with the size of the studio doubling to about 300, most of whom were full-time and full benefit employees, which wasn't good for this struggling business. It turned out the studio's lawyer, Brian Booth, had another client he could potentially ask to invest. As small as Portland was, there was in fact another local businessman who was very successful and who they've worked with before. If you've seen my other videos, you'll know, as this whole video is a loose follow-up to that one. Mr. Phil Knight of shoe company Nike, who had its origins right there in Portland and was now headquartered next door in Beaverton. Will Vinton Studios' lawyer made the introduction with Knight, who surprisingly offered up $3 million. According to several people, and even their lawyer Brian, this was completely out of character for Phil, investing in such a company. It made no sense. Phil Knight claimed he liked the studio because they reminded him of his younger entrepreneurial days. But we'll see later that he may have had ulterior motives from the start. There was another investor who agreed to $2 million, but they backed out and Tom Turpin asked Knight to raise his investment because they were desperate. "I liked it for $3 million and I like it for $5 million, said Knight. The only thing in exchange for the $5 million was of course 15% of the company and copies of their financial statements. And one other thing, Phil had a son named Travis who was pursuing a rap career under the name Chili T. His father tried everything to get his son's career off the ground, like building him a studio and hiring production teams. But it turned out this just wasn't for him. The sales were poor and Travis didn't like performing for music videos. Well, after rapping didn't work out, he graduated from Portland State University and didn't really have any future plans. So his dad Phil thought he'd hook Travis up with a gig at Will Vinton Studios where he just invested. So in 1998, Phil Knight became a minority shareholder and got his son Travis a job at Will Vinton Studios at the age of 25. Oh, and no one at the studio knew who Travis really was. Tom Turpin and Will thought it best to keep that hush-hush so he wouldn't get treated differently. Travis worked as an animator on their upcoming TV shows, as well as less creative tasks like sweeping and mopping the floors. The PJs aired on Fox in 1999 to positive reception from critics. And before it was even finished airing, another show called Gary and Mike was already in the works for UPN, or United Paramount Network. This was a big shift from whatever the studio had done before, a more adult show with themes of sex. The PJs ran for 2 seasons, winning 3 Emmys. However, the high cost and declining ratings made Fox drop the show, but there were 6 new episodes already produced and ready for a season 3. Thankfully, it was picked back up for a 3rd and final season by Warner Brothers. Gary and Mike was cancelled after just 1 season, despite having good viewership. It's said that UPN was having financial troubles. 10 episodes had already been planned for a season 2, but unfortunately the show ended on a cliffhanger. They had also produced an unaired pilot for something called Slacker Cats, which unfortunately ended up becoming this much uglier cartoon on ABC. There was another project called The Boyer Brothers, and another for a personal project of Will's called Clay's TV, but nothing came from any of those. The PJs and Gary and Mike did very well financially, with record profits of $28 million annually, and the studio had grown even more with a peak of about 450 employees. While they enjoyed success from TV shows and commercials, there was one glaring question for the studio. Who were they? Vinton aspired to be the next Disney, but his studio didn't have a style or any consistency of what they produced. Disney was crushing it in the 90s with films like Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, Toy Story, Hercules, Mulan, and the list goes on. They even had the stop-motion success of A Nightmare Before Christmas. Animation was hot, it was on fire, and Vinton didn't break into that space. Although they did try in the early 90s with his adaptation of the Frog Prince movie, which got cancelled due to budget. This failed movie will come up again later. The studio stuck to commercials for a long time and now TV shows, the first of which was shifting to CGI, and the latter wasn't even claymation anymore. It said Vinton was also stubborn, he wanted things done a certain way, and when people had better ideas than his own, he seldom listened or would push back. But he always remained optimistic that everything would work out, rather than fixing the problems. There was definitely a time when I was rolling the dice and growing the company, admitted Vinton. And even Tom Turpin said this: Will had an amazing ability to run into a brick wall 35,000 times and get up and do it again. Tom's contract was not renewed due to his performance. While the studio had been making a lot of money with the TV shows, Tom was a big spender and ran the studio in a much more corporate way than anyone was used to. One of these corporate decisions had been to rent an office in LA and build a $1 million escalator in it. This was meant to wow potential clients, but the office didn't get used and ended up being a huge money sink. Tom left the studio in 2001, around the same time both TV shows ended, and the same year the attacks happened at the World Trade Center. Why is that important? Well, advertising business slowed down dramatically as the economy took a hit. With their shows cancelled and commercials being put on hold, layoffs needed to happen. A corporate idea Vinton was adamantly against, but it was necessary. The studio downsized from their peak of 450 back to their original size of about 100 employees. The new CEO was a former Disney exec, Jeff Farnath, who took the role in September 2002, but had been chief financial officer for the studio since 2000. Vinton said he liked Jeff, but he didn't seem to understand the business since he came from such a large corporation with an endless budget, and that's not what Vinton Studios was. After quarters of downturn, the business was failing again. Jeff Varnath claimed they were soon going to be out of money to pay their employees, so he went to their investor Phil Knight to ask for more money, to which he obliged with contracts and paperwork that Will Vinton apparently didn't read and then signed. I'm not sure what he signed, but they called it an employment agreement. If Phil Knight was going to keep investing money into this place, he figured he might as well own it, since his son loved it and the studio was in talks of working with Tim Burton for Corpse Bride. Asking for more money obviously wasn't a good look, and it was clear tonight that the studio was being managed poorly. The thing is, with this investment made in October 2002, Phil Knight went from a minority shareholder to a majority shareholder. This investment was enough for Phil Knight to have control of the company. He became the chairman of the board and appointed his son Travis to the board of directors, along with 2 people from Nike. I read that Will tried to appeal emotionally to Phil at his Nike office, but Phil wasn't receptive to it and it only served to upset him. Will Vinton was backed into a scary corner. Phil obviously wasn't happy with him, and now he held most of the cards. Moreover, it seemed like Jeff Varnath, the new CEO, and Phil were in cahoots. Varnath really liked the investments from Phil Knight, and both seemed to agree that Vinton was holding the company back from making big money. Just months after, in 2003, Varnath claimed they needed investment yet again, to which Phil Knight stepped up to the plate to pay in exchange for even more shares of the company. But Will started to get suspicious. How did they need money again, as Varnath claimed? Something didn't add up, and Vinton went head to head with Knight. Though Phil Knight kept trying to buy more shares of the company, Vinton was there to block it through some sort of stock ownership structure. Those of you who know more about this kind of thing could shed some light on this, as this admittedly isn't my forte. Vinton's lawyers actually found a loophole that would let him buy stock, enough to buy the company back from Phil. But when Phil learned of this, he closed that loophole. The board and Vinton had a tense phone call, where Knight asked what Vinton hoped to accomplish by obstructing his plans, to which Vinton replied that he wanted a senior management change or wanted to be bought out. To which Knight threatened Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the studio, essentially bankrupting Vinton himself if he didn't allow Knight to continue with his actions. Several confirmed this threat, but Jeff Varnath denied it ever happening since he was Phil's right-hand man by now. As Jeff claimed, the company was going broke and they started laying off talented animators, people who had been there a long time, I guess to put pressure on Vinton. Phil Knight, who was obviously irritated by this point, brought on a man named Howard Slusher to negotiate a severance deal with Vinton. Slusher was a real tough negotiator, Phil's best, so much so that he had actually just retired, but Phil asked him for this favor. The best deal Vinton was offered was 2 years' salary and $180,000 for his stock, which was reported to actually be worth more than $10 million. Take those numbers with a grain of salt, as different articles say different things. But the one thing every package they offered had in common was that Vinton couldn't sue Phil Knight or the company. They gave Will the weekend to think it over, with the threat of bankruptcy looming over his head if he didn't sign by Monday morning. When Will Vinton met with Howard Slusher on Monday, he tried negotiating a better offer, but Phil Knight hired Slusher for a reason, so Vinton could walk away with as little as possible. He would say 3, and you would say, how about 3.2? And he says, okay, 2, said Vinton about Slusher. No agreement was met, and all that talk about bankrupting the company was a fluke. But on April 14th, Will had resigned from the board. Not sure why, that seems like a bad decision, but like I said, this business stuff isn't my expertise. 3 days later, on April 17th, Jeff Varnath came to Vinton's office and said they needed to cut staff again to reduce costs, and then said, "Oh, and by the way, you're one of the cuts." The studio didn't officially release a statement, but Will sent out an email telling everyone about his departure and inviting them to the Bridgeport Brew Pub after work for a farewell. Varnath again defending Knight, saying it was he who thought of firing Vinton, not Knight. But you just know it was probably both their ideas. He even said, "Phil is literally the White Knight in the story," when talking about how Phil saved the company. Anyway, because Will didn't sign any of those packages, he walked away with virtually nothing. Just a broken heart and a small lump sum of $50,000, which was part of the contract he signed last October when Knight took control. What was also part of those contracts was that they could fire Vinton without cause, which I don't know why they didn't do sooner if that was the case. Maybe Phil Knight really didn't plan on firing Vinton and it was all Jeff Farnat's idea. But that's how Will Vinton lost it all. The studio he built with just 6 people that had generated millions and paved the way for Claymation. Now it was all in the hands of the multi-billionaire Phil Knight and his son. Fortunately, Will held on to his stock, and I don't know what happened to it. I read it devalued, but it was probably better than selling it for $180,000 as offered. Vinton went on to sue Knight and the board shortly after, which is the footage you've been seeing, for their unjust actions and for manipulating him and forcing Vinton out of his own company so Phil could give it to his son Travis. He sought $3.1 million in economic damages, but seeing as how Will signed all the paperwork that said he agreed to being fired without cause, the case was dismissed. Coincidentally or not, the day after Will was let go, the studio had signed a contract to work with Warner Brothers for Tim Burton's new film Corpse Bride, which was released in 2005. But before that came out, we need to check on Bob Gardner again. Born in Torrance, California in 1951, James Robbins Gardner grew up with 5 siblings. Their parents had given them all Native American names, Bob's being Coyote, a name that would have meaning to Bob's character. A coyote can disappear and no one will know where he went, said John Gardner, his brother. Last we checked, Bob started working at the Powerhouse Mining Museum, which he really enjoyed, but sadly lost his job there after several years, something he was very saddened by. Bob's mother and father passed away in 2002 and 2004 respectively. By this point he was staying at the Everhard Hotel, where his 1-bedroom apartment doubled as his art studio. He did small-time work like flyers and signs. Though he didn't have much money, his sister Ann Gardner said he would always try to give her some, even when she didn't need it. He was generous to a fault, she said. Ann received a worrying phone call in early April 2005 about Bob being seen drinking at the art center. You see, Bob quit drinking in 2001 after going through Alcoholics Anonymous. It said his manic behavior was attributed to his drinking. Sometime in mid-April, the same month he was caught with alcohol, Bob had gotten arrested for an incident involving someone trying to take his picture and Bob getting upset. On April 20th, a friend of Gardner's was having coffee with him. He said it was the usual kind of conversation. He could connect George Bush to a Neanderthal man to the impurities in Cheerios in 1 minute. I'd never heard a brain like that, said his friend Herb Robbins. But one theme that was always present in Bob's conversations was, of course, Will Vinton. He never let it go. Presumably that same day, his daughters tried to contact Bob, but to no avail. Gardner was to appear in court on Monday the 25th, but the day after having coffee with his friend, his daughters still couldn't contact him and feared the worst, calling the Grass Valley police to the scene. On April 21st, 2005, the artist behind Closed Mondays, who had gone through so much self-torment, had tragically taken his own in his Everhard hotel room at the age of 54. When his daughter Nikki went to the apartment, she found Bob's piano with sheet music on it. Sheet music of I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Many were shocked and saddened, including Will Vinton. Will said he really wished he could have done more for Bob, sing his praises more. Which is an interesting statement given the fact that Will seemingly took a lot of the credit for inventing Claymation.
Wait, is Mr. Gardner the one who is the true creator of Claymation? Answer the question.
Mr. Gardner, absolutely not.
Did you develop it jointly with Mr. Gardner?
Absolutely not. Claymation was developed several years after I worked with Bob Gardner.
Others were shocked to find Bob was never medicated for mental illness, but his family said it wouldn't have mattered because he would have stubbornly refused. And that's how Bob's story ended. An unfortunate tale of torment and lost potential. Will Vinton Studios persisted, but a lot of the old staff had been let go, and by July 2005, Will Vinton Studios was no more, being rebranded as Laika, and now that it was officially a father-son business venture, the investment money from Phil Knight poured in. $180 million of Phil Knight's own money was given, with $55 million being used to build a campus designed by the same architect that designed the Nike headquarters, complete with a large 300-seat theater, a workout facility, and more. They also hired new talent from Disney, DreamWorks, and Pixar, and brought on the talent of Henry Selick, the director behind The Nightmare Before Christmas. The studio went on to create some pretty great claymation films that were pop culture hits, their first being Coraline, directed by Henry Selick, which was very profitable with a $60 million budget and a $130 million box office. I have some great info on Travis Knight and Laika that I'll share at a later time as this video is long enough, so be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to catch that video. You know, say what you will about Travis, about daddy's money or what have you, but that doesn't mean he hasn't done some great stuff. He is an artist in his own right and deserves some credit, regardless of how he may have stumbled upon success. Actually, he had become one of the most skilled animators working at Will Vinton Studios, so he definitely had a calling and passion for animation. He wasn't a director right away, but finally grew into that role for movies like Kubo and the Two Strings, which is pretty great, and the Transformers movie Bumblebee, which is the best reviewed live-action Transformers movie, yet the worst performing. He's even set to direct a He-Man film in the future, so let's see how that goes. I will say, however, it's pretty funny how Laika tries to hide their origins.
Evolved. It was an opportunity that came up. It's something I always loved, and when the opportunity was presented to me, I took it, grabbed it and ran with it.
So was Laika the opportunity, or was there an opportunity before that?
I worked at another animation house before that.
So were you down here, or were you?
Up in Portland.
Up in Portland.
Yeah.
So you've been in Portland?
Yeah, I guess there's nothing to really brag about when your billionaire father handed you the keys. There's no humble origin story there. Oh, and another funny thing. Jeff Fornath, I guess, had a falling out with Phil Knight in 2005. It said Jeff couldn't come to terms with his contract renewal, so he left. So much for all that sucking up. Actually, a pretty similar thing happened to Henry Selick, who left the studio after Coraline, since he couldn't negotiate his contract renewal. I also read that he got tired of waiting for Laika to give him another contract, since they didn't have another film in the pipeline for him to direct. Either way, it's Laika's loss. And what about Will Vinton? What did he do after? Well, things were pretty tough on him afterwards, especially financially. Pretty much all his wealth was tied up in the Vinton Studios stock. He had to sell his home, pull his two sons out of private school, and scale back his luxurious lifestyle. But it wasn't all bad. He got his wish of working as a creative again. He started a new production company, Free Will Entertainment. He went back to doing short films, like this first one, The Morning After, where a woman wakes up after having slept with a,
I see where you're going with this. The two of us together, gorgeous babe like you hanging with, well, you know, a big cartoon bear.
There was even an unrealized ABC Christmas movie Will wrote called The Minstrel Tree, along with some TV plots and other indie projects. However, a few other odd and noteworthy projects of Will were creating a comic called Jack Hightower, about a 10-inch superhero, and working on an invention called Inselastics, a project he worked on with Hollywood production designer and artist Bill McAllister. They created building materials out of recycled plastics like insulation, exterior panels, and more. Will had also been giving courses at the Art Institute of Portland, among his most popular being his claymation classes. Well, in 2008, he actually produced a film using his students' talents called The Martial Artist, and I believe he retired from filmmaking after this. But later, he did try partnering with Gnosis Moving Pictures for a slew of CGI films, like an adaptation of Moby Dick, Vinton's own Jack Hightower comic, and more. The films never got made, however. Oh, and if you're wondering what Will thought of Laika Studios and other Clay films, well, he was glad to see Clay animation take off and become more popular than ever, but he was also disappointed in the lack of diversity. He really wanted to see Claymation tackle more genres and not just be these safe family-friendly children's movies. Out of all these post-Vinton Studios projects, by far his proudest was finally realizing his adaptation of The Frog Prince. Yes, I mentioned this earlier as a cancelled film from the early 90s. Well, Vinton held on to the idea and planned it as a musical all the way back in 1993 with a musician who had been recommended to him, David Pomeranz, who was also going to produce the music for the cancelled film. The two felt the story was better suited for the stage anyway, so they went forward with that idea and called the play The Kiss, and eventually turned to Kickstarter to help with funding, asking for about $80,000 but only raising about 20% of that. Will Vinton had actually been diagnosed with multiple myeloma cancer in 2006, so he had been several years into treatment by this point. Obviously, this was a concern to his loved ones, but it was something he tried keeping a positive attitude about, which was sometimes difficult for his friends and family since they always wanted to know about his condition and he'd rather talk about his play. Progress on The Kiss was slow, and doing a full production was more difficult than Will or David Pomeranz anticipated. Thankfully, a man named Greg Tamblyn came into a rehearsal one day to support a friend who was working on the production. Greg was actually a seasoned director, and Will asked him his opinion on the play, to which he said, "A lot of the elements were there, but it wasn't connected very well. A lot of entertainment, but too little character development." To which Vinton disagreed and said he thought it was coming along great. But Vinton kept hearing the same critique from others and eventually swallowed his pride and called up Greg Tamblyn to ask him to join the production. He accepted, and Greg and Will then meticulously worked on the first and second acts. In 2015, a filmmaker by the name Mark Evans came across the story of the rise and fall of Will Vinton Studios and thought it would make for a great documentary, so he shot Vinton an email. Will's wife, Jillian, wrote back saying Will had no interest but would still meet with Mark for a conversation. After about 6 months of communication, Will finally came around and accepted the idea, and that's how we got the docu-film Clay Dream. Thankfully, Will agreed to the documentary, as it's where we got a lot of the information for this video. Mr. Evans got to document a very important and influential artist in film and animation history, but more importantly, this documentary came just in time, as on October 4th, 2018, only 3 years following Mark Evans beginning work on the documentary, Will Vinton, the man behind Claymation, passed away after a long 12-year battle with blood cancer, leaving behind his wife Jillian, his 2 sons Jesse and Billy, and daughter Alexandria. Also leaving behind unfinished work, his play The Kiss. I thought the project was pretty much over, said The Kiss director Greg Tamblyn. But in a surprise, Will Vinton had a backup, his son Jesse, who was a filmmaker just like his old man. He really followed in his father's footsteps, writing short films like Masks of Desire, which won the Audience Choice Award at the Holly Shorts Film Festival in Los Angeles, as well as writing Waiting Game, which won the Portland 48-Hour Film Festival and was later accepted into the Cannes Short Film Corner in 2020. On top of film, he did commercial work for some big clients like Adidas, Under Armour, and Microsoft, among others. Shortly before his father's passing, Jesse was given his father's blessing. He said his father never wanted him to feel burdened by his projects, but this was the one exception. Will told his son, "If you'd like to, this is the one you could take on and complete." And this Jesse did. Funny enough, Jesse disliked his father's work as a kid, since he would have much rather be taken to the park than stay and watch his father mess around with clay. After Will passed, Jesse contacted his father's old friend, musician David Pomeranz, to take up his father's mantle. "David trusted me from the get-go," said Jesse. "He believed in me." He also grabbed Greg Tamblyn, and the three fulfilled Will Vinton's final wish. While it was difficult, the team said they could feel Will's presence reassuring them with trust. In July 2022, nearly 30 years after Will first conceptualized the play, it was finally real. It premiered at the Lake Oswego's Lakewood Center and was met with a very positive and lively audience reaction. It was funny, sarcastic, and emotional in more ways than one. The audience rose and cheered with a standing ovation. And this closed the final chapter of Will Vinton's story, but that doesn't mean he's gone. As with all great artists, the work will continue to live on for those of us who hold it near and dear to our hearts, and by other creators who continue to be inspired by their works. From shows and movies to even games now, Claymation is not dead. It is alive and well thanks to pioneers like Mr. William Vinton. Thank you for watching. Another very long video that I didn't expect to take this amount of time. There was just so much great stuff to cover and I couldn't help myself. Before we end it, I'd like to give a big thank you to YouTube channel Animate Clay. He was an amazing source of knowledge on all things clay animation and helped me with a lot of the info in this video whenever I couldn't find the answers online. Go check out his channel and subscribe to him if you're interested in more Claymation content. He even has an interview with Will Vinton himself. I tried reaching out to several people for this video and Animate Clay was the only person who ever got back to me, so thank you again. The more I dug into this story, the more I realized how passionate this community of clay animators are, so I hope I did this story of Claymation justice. My videos try to cover a lot of details about an artist that might get overlooked in the grand scheme of things, but of course I can't cover everything and a lot ends up on the cutting room floor. So please leave any additional information you have about Will Vinton or clay animation in general in the comments. Let's try to have some informative discussions, as I'd love for this to be a place for others to learn. Alright, that's it for me. Remember to stay cultured and I'll see you all next time.